Hello, comrades. Now, this is kind of a rare thing for me, but I'm going to start with a song. Not one that I'm going to sing to you, thank fuck for that, but it's actually a song by an American band called Chat Pile, from the album I believe called God's Country. And they have a song which is comprised mostly of a single question, which is why? The refrain is this: why do people have to live outside? Why? I couldn't live outside in the blazing heat and all the cold. Why do people have to live outside? Why? And to some extent, this question is left unanswered. But in the end, they all affirm the same thing about it, which is it's a real fucking horror story. It's a real American fucking horror story. And the name of that horror story is capitalism. And today, I am joined, of course, by returning champion John Greenaway to talk about his latest book, Capitalism, a Horror Story, Gothic Marxism and the Dark Side of the Radical Imagination. John, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back. I am super excited to be here.
So some people listening to this will know you, of course, from your podcast Horror Vanguard and your previous writings on horror in the 19th century, as well as your previous book with Zero this year about Ernst Bloch. But just to make sort of a methodological distinction here, this book isn't a book about Marxist horror movies. It's a Marxist look at the concept of horror itself. Where do you sort of start making that distinction here? Because it's not a history of Marxist horror, it's a Marxist history of the Gothic and the horrific insofar as they can be identified. There's that one aspect of not simply talking about texts that are Marxist, but they're taking a Marxist cultural approach to them. But there's, of course, the specific sort of mode of doing that you take up from Ernst Bloch, which is the idea of being both the detective and the liberator. Is that similar to the method of Gothic Marxism? And in that sense, what is it trying to liberate and what is it trying to detect?
Yeah. So very broadly, I think the book breaks into two relatively uneven halves. So firstly, you have a kind of Gothic Marxist section at the beginning, which is a bit more theory heavy. And then you have a kind of Marxist Gothic, which is in the back half before it all comes together in the end. And it's exactly as you say. So the point is, what are we trying to detect is the utopian possibilities and traces within the most kind of degraded, ostensibly low popular cultural forms. And what we're trying to liberate is the revolutionary capacity or the revolutionary critique that is kind of implicitly structured within those forms. So something that I think is very true is that we live in a culture that is often banally optimistic. I think Marvel superhero films are, all about the restoration of the status quo. And I think one thing about horror is that it takes seriously the concept of rupture, of a kind of revolutionary historical rupture primarily. So the past is not dead in the Gothic and horror. The past is this, or rather the dead keep returning and making demands, often very violent demands, upon the present situation. And so the aim of the book is to try and move beyond a kind of like naive correlationist historicism where we go, the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker is really about the fin de siècle and the anxieties of British imperialism, which is true. But also, it's perfectly possible to read Dracula as an attempt to grapple or to take seriously the utopian anti-work politics that is enabled by kind of like parasitic extraction that makes up capitalism. So what are we trying to detect? We're trying to detect unfinished history. And what are we trying to liberate is we're trying to liberate the often very bloody, violent possibilities of that history that capitalists, what Benjamin would call kind of capitalist myths of progress, have tried to occlude in its naturalized sense of historical continuity.
I think the Dracula example, even though it's quite complex as sort of an archetypal horror text, the way he presents it is actually quite fascinating in terms of
Mm.
not sticking with that surface reading. Because when he was talking about sort of, yeah, Dracula is just about the it's just about the anxieties of British imperialism, these rich aristocratic Europeans coming, and the aristocrat being a figure from the pre-feudal era who is seen as decadent or libertinish. I mean, it reminds me of a sense in which what you're going deeper beyond the standard Marxist readings, but in an explicitly Marxist way. And I was thinking when he was talking about this, I was thinking about, for example, a book which has a kind of terror in it, but isn't considered a horror book, and that's H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, in
Hmm.
which it is explicitly said. It literally at one point, I mean, the readers, so this is sort of the book is structured like a journalistic narrative of an invasion, but it is written
Mm.
explicitly to deny any kind of monstrosity or sort of gothic element to the aliens, because at one point the narrator literally turns to the camera in a kind of pre photographic sense and says, well, we shouldn't really judge these Martians too much. I mean, they just shot their cannons at us, and we did exactly the same thing to the people of Tasmania as the British Empire that we're doing to it. So really we're all kind of the same. It's nothing exceptional, but there is terror,
Hmm.
but there isn't horror. So let's just
Hmm.
get into the meat of what this horror is here, because if we're going to sort of dig for there's like something that haunts us. In a way, there's kind of a theory of time here as well. It's not just if you're critiquing progress, you're critiquing a kind of purely linear version of time. And in a way, the
Hmm.
horrific images of, for example, ghosting and haunting, those challenge the linearity of time, don't they? In a sense, especially in terms of latent possibilities for something to be otherwise.
Yeah, as I say in the book, the Gothic is history out of time, and it's like it's and in a sense, then is the creation of a new historicity. Um, so a line that I borrow from Stephen Shapiro is that the Gothic is if for the Gothic history is what hurts, for horror history is what bleeds. And there is so for me, this is why I focus on quite a lot of modern horror movies. Even though I do kind of try and talk a little bit about Dracula and Frankenstein in the 19th century, a lot of the book is about contemporary horror. And it's precisely because it's the contemporary horror film where you see the kind of phenomenological and physical experiences of contemporary capitalism, right? What does it feel like to live now? What is the toll in the literal blood and flesh price that we all pay for the contemporary state of things? And that's what horror movies provide that I don't think anything else can provide in the same way. And yes, like trying to talk about the Gothic as well in this context is to connect horror with the Gothic, even though the two are not quite the same thing, but also to kind of revivify and put some blood back into this conception of history as being fundamentally unfinished. I mean, obviously, in terms of contemporary analogies, it's indebted to someone like Mark Fisher. This idea of like popular modernism and the hauntological relationship of the past to the future. But that's like an older Gothic idea, that this notion of like and the philosophical route that you can take doesn't necessarily like follow the Fisherian heritage, but goes back through Benjamin and like the fundamentally unfinished nature of history itself, right? And this idea that like the dead make demands upon us, which is both a very Gothic idea and is actually a kind of like quite revolutionary Marxist idea as well.
Could we go a bit further into this idea that the dead demand of us? Because there's a certain element here, it's very much tied to your reading of Walter Benjamin, which is the idea
Mhm.
of tradition. Because in ways, there are two ways in which the idea of tradition has been cashed out in terms of sort of the voices of the dead speaking to us. I'm thinking initially about G.K. Chesterton. He
Mhm.
says, I think it's in Orthodoxy, that the tradition is the democracy of the dead. They cast their
Mhm.
votes up, and he uses that to articulate more of a contemporary, well, classical, I guess, Catholic position. But you're
Mhm.
drawing on upon essentially a tradition of the oppressed as such. It's not just any tradition. There's a specific tradition which has not been allowed to speak in the way that, for example, for Chesterton, the voice of the dead may speak in
Yeah.
Catholic hierarchy, or or even something like constitutional monarchy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this is more broadly connected to what the tradition that I kind of like. It's another tradition that I sort of put myself into, which is revolutionary romanticism. So, or anti-capitalist romanticism, and it's first labeled this as such by Lukács, referring to Bloch specifically, actually. And Lukács is quite scathing about it because he thinks that it necessarily leads to irrationalism and thus fascism. But I think there are good historical reasons for him to make that critique, right? But I actually think the danger is you cede too much ground, and you cede the ground of the imagination to kind of capitalist naturalization without having this concept. So yes, the tradition is that of the dead, but the dead do not speak in the tradition that we think we've inherited, right? So to put this again in sort of Chestertonian terms, Chesterton and other more conservative romantics look at the past as a kind of prelapsarian state. You want to get back to the tradition of the dead because it's the loss of that tradition which is the kind of fallen state that we exist in now, right? So for the Gothic Marxist, you look at the unfinished, unquiet dead of history, and you see not a return, not something that you want to go back to, but you see there a catalyst for the actual fulfillment of history, which is what? That's revolution. And it's actually in the context of revolutionary struggle that history starts or makes sense at all. So, for Benjamin, the point is, and I think for me, the point is to look back, but solely in order not to return, but to move forward into a future which has to be determined through struggle.
Communism is the unfinished business of its own spectre to some extent.
Yeah, precisely.
I mean, it just to throw a slight curveball here in terms of dead speaking. Let's take this to a horror archetype: the haunted house. The haunted house is kind of one of the archetypes of the dead speaking to us. And I mean, recently there's been some amazing, well, last few years, some amazing haunted house movies. My favorite, listeners, it's a movie on Netflix called His House, which is about people fleeing war in, I think, sort of Central Africa. They eventually escape to England, are given a kind of a decrepit council house, and the unfinished business, sort of the trauma of getting there and the trauma of the surveillance by the British state kind of haunts them. And I just wanted to ask this, in the all the movies you've seen in terms of the haunted house as an archetype, how does that fit into this idea of the dead speaking to us from a cultural, sort of romantic, anti-capitalist, Gothic Marxist analysis?
Yeah, so the question I suppose really is like, what is the haunted house doing? And what can it do in terms of our kind of understanding of the ideological totality in which we exist? His House is a really good example. It's an incredible film if people haven't seen it. A kind of older example, which emerges in the 70s, is the Amityville Horror Story. And this is a haunted house because it's the site of a mass murder, and a family gets the house as a kind of bargain on the real estate market, but can't afford to sell it when they realize what's going on. And really, houses are about memory, loss, domesticity, and finance. These are the kind of four sectors that the house exists within. It's not a surprise that post-2008, we saw a massive resurgence of the haunted house film. The biggest horror franchise from like 2008 to like 2013 was probably Paranormal Activity, which is all about the possession of houses. It's about people who buy their first house and then violent spectral forces exert control over it in ways they don't fully understand or aren't able to do anything about. And the kind of like depressing statistics from the US are, millions of people during that window of 2008 to around 2013, millions of people lost their homes, had their homes foreclosed upon. And the vast majority of those people never returned to owning a home or never returned to having a mortgage. So one thing that the haunted house film, and actually all horror films, are really useful for is making explicit this often unarticulated ideological substrate that structures the kind of broader social totality of how we are supposed to relate to things. So His House is such a good example because it features quite a lot of ghosts, right? But the ghost is always about loss. Like ghosts are not necessarily just scary. Ghosts are melancholic. Why? Because they are that which is, but is no longer. They are the kind of absent present. There's something that, and so the kind of horror of his house is not the fact that the ghosts are there; it's the fact that you haven't joined them. Right? This for the refugee struggle is like sometimes maybe what is worse is to be the one who does make it, because it means that all of those other people that you loved and cared about, they haven't made it too. So what I think something I say on Horror Vanguard all the time is like horror movies are very ideologically honest. They can't help it. They are forever saying the quiet part loud. And sometimes that is deeply reactionary, but that isn't a surprise given the kind of social totality in which we exist. But what they are is also able to understand the kind of subjective psychological response to these things, right? I think homes being repossessed is not like so much of the subprime mortgage crisis was framed as this kind of like dry matter of, you know, numbers on a spreadsheet, but it was violent. It was terrifying. It was a home that you thought that was yours turned out to be possessed by this kind of spectral figure of debt. And I think it's very telling, you know, what is a mortgage? Le mortgage, the deal with the dead. Essentially, the housing market is an occult nightmare, and that's what the Haunted House film renders very explicitly visible. And this is true historically, right? What is Dracula really about? Dracula wants to buy property. Like the whole reason that Jonathan Harker makes his journey out to Transylvania is he's a solicitor and he's there to do conveyancing. He's there to do the necessary legalese to ensure that Dracula can get his hands on property in London. So it's always been the case, I think, that matters of property, matters of inheritance are tied up within actually really deep-seated fears.
You've just helped me realize something right now, because I didn't quite put some of my own work in a Gothic Marxist context, but in my work on Stirner, he's a great thinker about ghosts and possession.
Mm-hmm.
Property itself is a fucking horror story. Well, particularly it's a ghost story, because it's the idea that to possess an external thing suggests, especially in the sort of way that famous philosophers of property such as Hegel have portrayed it, that there is something about your psyche, your very existence, that is imprinted on an external thing, regardless of where you are. And to defend that narrative, to defend that's purely spiritual and literal Hegelian sense possession, the state is willing to back this ghost story. The property is basically a ghost story that is backed by nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and backed, or even just like subjective violence, right? And that subjective violence is always reflective of precisely that, of the nuclear weapons, of the kind of background radiation violence of the capitalist state. Because really, ultimately, if you start to threaten property relations, that's when things get quite serious, right? If you start to try and deal with the haunted nature of the commodity, that, you know, that's when you're touching the live wire.
This reminds me a little bit of one of the main focuses of your book, was the Purge films. And because there are no ghosts in the Purge films, because that is the time in which you finish your business. That is the time in which business is killing, and killing is my business and business is good, to quote fucking Megadeth. Yeah. I mean, that is there is no spectre there, because it is returning to that pure immediacy in which to possess something you have to grab hold of it, otherwise someone's going to beat you with a baseball bat. And even then, as I re-listened to the Purge retrospective recently over on Horror Vanguard, and folks, one, just go listen to it, but two, I wouldn't recommend them as good movies, but I recommend the podcast as a good analysis of a good concept, not particularly well executed in a movie. But
I'm very fond. I'm very fond of both the Purge films and the Saw films, because I write about them both in one chapter. They aren't good. They're not good, but I can't stop thinking about them. And yeah, both of them, both of those film franchises, and one cover from the other, in terms of like over the course of a decade, is that both of them are about the necessity of violence as it relates to property. The necessity of violence, and the necessity of violence within a capitalist system, and where it seems that really the only thing you can do is you can kind of like is cathexis. That's the only thing you can really try and do. You can't ever question the system itself.
I mean, speaking of movies which I cannot help thinking about thanks to Horror Vanguard, I can't also not bring up Repo, the genetic opera, in which listeners, sorry, one's organs literally become possessed in a legal sense by a foreign corporate entity, or just a
Mhm.
corporate entity, an alien corporate entity, and then your own body itself becomes unfinished business for the slaughter bench of history, as Hegel puts it.
Mhm.
But just sticking with that theme of the body, just as a slight segue there, one of my favorite phrases from Horror Vanguard is that horror wants to do something to your body. And chapter 4 of Capitalism, a Horror Story really wants to focus on post-COVID cinema as sort of an evolution of body horror, or maybe even exhibition of its
Mhm.
purest traits. And of course, you go through mostly 4 films in this chapter. So, The Sadness, Beach House, and then the father and son Cronenberg, that is Possessor and Crimes of the Future. How do you see
Mhm.
body horror, or the relation to body, being, it's not changed, but at least brought to the forefront in the, I won't say post-COVID era, because COVID, of course, is still ongoing, but the post-initial shock of that era? Because typically in
Yeah.
culture, culture sometimes has a hard time remembering pandemics. There's not as much direct horror, or at least recognizable horror, for example, about Spanish flu. There is a lot about the plague, but that's more
Mhm.
about the religious imagery, the apocalyptic end of days, whereas we sort of knew the Spanish flu wasn't the end of days. How does body horror and a Gothic analysis of it sort of come to the forefront in the era of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think so. Body horror emerges mostly at times of crisis, right? So it coalesces in the 70s and 80s as a specific term in film theory, um, mostly as it relates to the AIDS crisis. Um, and really, it's a particular modern phenomena, I think, for the capitalism of late modernity, because the entire point here is to abstract away the very kind of messy, infleshed nature of our subjectivity, right? Death becomes invisibilized, becomes kind of shunted out of society. So the thing about the first couple of years of the COVID pandemic in its high point is the resurgence of kind of like paranoia, and not a misplaced paranoia either. I think there is this combination of like a genuine and real concrete threat, and also a kind of nebulous lack of understanding of how that threat realizes itself, which is focalized in and through the body. Over on Horror Vanguard, we've also talked about Safe, Todd Haynes' film from the 1990s, which is about someone who seems to develop this kind of like almost debilitating allergy to her modern suburban existence, and ends up sort of retreating to a sort of commune-like existence in the desert, away from all of modern life. And there's, in a way, that's a body horror film, right? Even though you don't see the kind of like same level of blood and violence that you would normally expect to in a traditional body horror film like The Thing or Cronenberg's The Fly. But really, the thing that's interesting about body horror is the way in which that vulnerability and contingency in the contemporary age is received quite differently. So from these two of the films that you mentioned, the two really good poles, the opposite poles of things, are The Sadness and Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future. So for Cronenberg, Crimes of the Future is a weirdly, I think, quite optimistic film, because it points out human contingency and fragility of flesh becoming something which is no longer under our own control, an end to this model of a kind of like monad-esque subjectivity, but also that we become something different, we become something else. The Sadness is deeply misanthropic about that process and sees it as inevitably, if we were not this, we would descend into kind of like psychopathy and violence, which is quite a pathologizing notion of like subjective transformation. Cronenberg is much more interesting because he thinks that that transformation of subjectivity is really the closest and maybe the only thing left to actual genuine art. Because that's literally what Crimes of the Future is about. It's about a performance artist whose body changes in ways that he seemingly can't control. But that change, and he is his artistic practice. His art is not really just what he does. It's kind of who he is. So I think the resurgence of body horror is interesting because it's a way of like working out the sort of like psychic aftermath. Like, what do we really think about ourselves in the wake of COVID-19 and this reminder of our essential entanglement with one another and our essential fragile contingency, and the ways in which this notion of kind of like physical normativity becomes something that is very porous. So for some, the horror film responds to that with violence, you know, the death and like reducing the body to just so much meat that you can do things to. Whereas for Cronenberg, and in a way Brandon Cronenberg too, it becomes a chance to like think about new modes of subjectivity.
Yeah, but the weird tension with the pandemic and the lockdowns was it was both a chance if one was lucky to not work in so-called essential labor, you mostly delivery drivers, nurses, care workers, supermarket workers, and people could move somewhat online. If one had like email jobs, one was student. There was a sense in which the pandemic was both the horrifying reminder that one both has and maybe is a body, and then at the same time a great attachment from it in this very videodrome kind of translation into the online. But then if you get into the online, actually viruses and the online are actually quite into the quite similar in terms of the process of, I mean, a virus rewrites genetic code, semiotic codes are rewritten and mutate all the time through say memetics, for lack of a better term, or we call going viral. I mean, the pandemic was a horrific event, but yet it was sometimes so banal. I mean, remember waiting to see the death toll every day, and that became so mediated through the screen that something like Crimes of the Future, it when I first watched it, I was expecting this kind of Videodrome-esque kind of pessimism about these kind of developments of the body. But then there's that one scene, you know, in the film when there is a performer who has his eyes are sewed closed, he's coated in that sort of like prosthetic ears, and there's a VCR that keeps projecting the words "body is reality," and Cronenberg is sort of taking the piss out of this a bit because there's a further evolution there, and he is very optimistic, yes, because I mean, folks, in the movie, humans can no longer feel physical pain, and so the essential effective boundary between us, at least the most primal level, is now taken apart because surgery is the new sex. But there's a kind of a counterpoint, or at least a relative change in this, to a slightly pessimistic view of the body, but nonetheless one that is not quite fully full of despair, which is Beach House. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because that's one of the movies that you sort of really focus on in particular. I mean, the last line of this movie, folks, is "Do not be afraid." I mean, that's not spoiler because it doesn't know what you're being afraid of.
Yeah, in a way, the Beach House sort of reminds me of Lockdown. It's very mundane. It's very mundane, and it's about two couples who end up sort of being thrown together, and something sort of happens one night. Something quite literally falls out of the sky, and the world is kind of irrevocably changed by it. And suddenly, this is the combination of kind of boring. It's a sort of a boring apocalypse, right? You end up with people that you probably wouldn't have chosen to be with. One of the couples is, you know, a kind of heterosexual couple who's probably headed for a breakup, because things just are not working out. They're going in different directions in life, but they end up kind of thrown together by this disaster. And so the Beach House is interesting precisely in its mundanity. You know, it's the line from Benjamin that I quote, which is that sometimes there isn't a catastrophe. Sometimes things just go on, and that's the catastrophe. Like even in the middle of a pandemic, you still had to go to work, or even if your work was now something that happened, you know, in your bedroom on a laptop screen. Even in the middle of a pandemic, I think a really good example actually of this is with the big Microsoft outage, and I saw a headline from a newspaper live blog, which is Microsoft outage affects life around the world. The stock market doesn't notice. Like the catastrophe is that things just continue. But the end of the Beach House is really interesting because all of the characters make generally pretty sensible choices. I think that, you know, this is the thing that people dislike about horror movies, that someone makes this very silly choice. They stick together, they try and find help, but like what help there is no longer exists. Nobody's coming. And actually what's going to happen to them is completely out of their control. So right at the end, a character is lying on the beach and is dying, ? And the thing that she says directly into the camera is, "Don't be afraid." And so the thing that I ask in the book is like, who is this addressed to? Who is the addressee of the speech? Is she talking to herself, or but it's straight down the camera lens. It's like a throwback to Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You know, you're next. It's like this is addressed to us. It's this idea of like, when reminded of our own fundamental vulnerability and powerlessness, what is there except to embrace the possibility of the new that arrives? Something I maybe should have mentioned is Seth Brundle, Cronenberg's famous character from The Fly. Because what happens to Seth Brundle, if you've ever seen The Fly, is revolting. It's disgusting. There's pus and blood, and his nails fall off. But the thing that he says is that this thing is changing me into something new. And that's not so bad, is it? Most people would give anything to be something else. And so this is why I think Cronenberg is maybe the more... hopeful is often used in quite a blithe way. He's not an optimist, but he is like... This idea of subjective transformation is not something that's necessarily annihilationist. It doesn't mean that subjectivity stops. It just means that subjectivity becomes something else.
It reminds me a lot, actually, of certain literary responses to John Carpenter's The Thing, another text I found out through Horror Vanguard comrades, which is Peter Watts, the author of Blindsight, wrote a brilliant short story. I think it's available on Clarksworld, called The Things, and it's about the thing from the perspective of the alien that meets us and goes, "They're all enclosed within a skull. Oh my God, it's disgusting. I'm trying to give these people communion with everything." And then this is kind of a recurring theme in our sort of most existential kinds of cinema. I'm talking about Evangelion here. The idea of subtracting the bound, not the subjective dimension, but the boundaries of it. There is such a kind of fear there, and I think the virus, as you say, very much exacerbates that, because it shows that communication includes the body. And one of the things you try to highlight in chapter 4 is the idea of consciousness of the body as something being mediated through new forms of capitalist domination, and particularly social media. I mean, this is why you focus so much on Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor. I mean, could you develop on that in terms of the new frontiers of body horror today?
I mean, this is where I think there's some overlap with things like Anti-Oculus, right? And even your own work that's forthcoming, which maybe we can talk a little bit about. So Possessor is a really interesting film, and is about essentially a psychic assassin who gets inside the head of someone and sort of pilots them in order to commit crime and then escape. And the thing that's interesting about it, and it's very indebted to something like Scanners, and the thing that's interesting about it is that it understands that you can't just get inside somebody's head without actually letting them inside you. And you can't just get inside somebody else's consciousness in a kind of neat and easy way. There is always this kind of trace that remains. We become kind of very quickly entangled with each other. But the thing that the film is very good at exploring is like actually the domination of consciousness is much more efficient than the domination of the body. It's one thing to get somebody to go to an office or go to a factory for 8, 12, 16 hours a day and do physically perform tasks that you give them. It's another thing to be in such control of subjectivity that you remake consciousness itself. And really, the film is very good at kind of pointing out that this is what digital technology is designed to do, right? It's designed to reshape consciousness. It has some very prescient critiques of pattern recognition and pseudo AI, which is almost always underpinned by what Phil Jones calls micro work. this is the bit where our character, who is in control of the body of somebody else, is put in what is called in the film the mine, which is where you put on a headset and you're asked to do pattern recognition, which can be fed into a large language learning model, basically automating the solving of capture tests, right? So really the whole point of the film is about, it is not simply enough to control the body. You have to control consciousness, which means you have to control the body. So it kind of tries to dissolve this divide between there being, the old Cartesian dualism of like, you can make somebody do what you want, but they are free to think whatever they want. It's like, no, if you are made to do certain things, you will inevitably begin to think and be a certain kind of subject. So I think Possessor is actually just a phenomenal film. Andrea Riseborough is in it. She's amazing. It's full of some really quite incredible practical effects, which are pretty gnarly if you like that kind of thing. Sean Bean dies a very unpleasant death involving a fireplace poker. But that's tradition. So
it's killed.
But yeah, I think, yeah. But yeah, I think ultimately, like, Possessor is like an attempt to make body horror for the era of kind of digital neoliberal societies of control, because it really isn't enough, right? It doesn't really matter if you take the finger of someone. What matters is, can you reshape the subject? And if that means reshaping the body, then fine. It's really good on the question of entanglement. What does it mean to be a good, pliable subject? It's very telling that our primary character, who is an assassin, by the end can no longer look at herself in the mirror, precisely because she no longer recognizes what she sees looking back at her. So Possessor is a really interesting movie. And I feel like I didn't necessarily get a chance to kind of go into as much detail as I should have. But hopefully that gives a flavor of what the argument I'm trying to make about body horror is.
No, I think under the conditions of the contemporary control society, I mean, digitalization of every category. I mean, it's not even about when people hear the word controlling what people think, they tend to think of implantation of thoughts in a kind of more direct way. Like some machine says, you will think this, and therefore people think that. Rather, as you're saying, it's not. It's about setting limits to thought. It's about redirecting resistance to other kinds of thought and then circulating them in a certain way. I mean, this is kind of the old problematic of capitalist realism. Well, sometimes I feel that it is a bygone problematic, thankfully, not because Marx was wrong, because we can now see we now can imagine the future other than what is currently here. It's just for being the enemy has now gone from telling us it can't be possible to now fighting us on that very plane. It is no longer so much that we can't. Yes, you can have a place with. We can abolish rent. We can abolish prisons, but we're not going to. We're going to fight you for it. It's not so much we can't imagine it now, so much as the control systems are about redirecting our own resistance into powering their own ends. I mean, this is the function, of course, of recuperation. But in terms of the idea of categories and things that seed them, this goes to the heart of the real sort of beating heart of your horrific theory. Horror theory. It's not horrific, but it is horror theory, which is the focus on monstrosity. And here I want to interject with a distinction quite Spinozist, I know we both use, which is between. So for the listeners, in Spinoza, there's a distinction between natura naturata and natura naturans. It's a distinction between naturing nature, the productive force that produces natural objects, and those natural objects themselves that have been produced by the force that we may call nature or God if you're Spinoza, or nature or God if you're Spinoza. Thinking about what a monster is and the power that produces monstrosity, could we get into that a little bit before we just go forward?
Yeah, so monsters are revelations and warnings about something. So where does the monster come from, right? So the monster comes from, I mean, the very oldest one is don't walk through the woods at night. Why? Because there's a monster there. It comes from this idea that there is a kind of limit that can't be transgressed. But at the same time, the kind of very nature, the sort of like, it seems like there's something about the limit that kind of irresistibly draws us towards it, because the monster is a kind of herald of something. which is that this limit, which we take to be absolute and concrete, is a construct. It's something that can change. It's something that can suddenly include or exclude us. So really, the monster is not the thing which is the kind of journey that you go through is like the monster is the thing in the dark at night, and actually the kind of truth is the monster is that which is next to me at night. So what produces monstrosities are a series of political choices, and the kind of very basic argument is that there is nothing natural about the category of monster or to what that label is. There is no kind of natural law that corresponds to that. I mean, the War of the Worlds actually is a very good example of this, right? You know, oh no, the monsters have come from the sky, and Wells turns around and goes, actually, no, these aren't monsters at all. What are you talking about? There's nothing unique about this. So I think just on a very basic level, we have to be very aware about who or what is being labeled a monster. That's a political decision. That's something that there is a set of politics and political discourses which are about inscribing a limit somewhere discursively and creating a boundary that polices that limit. Because the monster is a threat, right? The monster is both a threat and revelation. And what does it threaten and what does it reveal? It reveals the new. And I use that in the kind of the capital N Blockian sense of the new, which is not just something novel or kind of surprising, but the new, or as Bloch would call it, the novum, is that which represents a kind of rupture in the order of things, right? It's closer to Badiou's event, right? So when you've encountered it, nothing can go back to being the same. So monstrosity, yeah. So this is why monstrosity is an important category, but it's a profoundly ambivalent category, and in fact, all of horror is, right. And it isn't something that is necessarily, it isn't something that's necessarily kind of like progressive or leftist or whatever. But the novum is not always pleasant, as Bloch, as Darko Suvin quite memorably puts it in one of his papers. The novum is not always a kind of good thing. The novum can be like horrifying. And it's about how do we respond and react to the new. So a really good example of this is Thomas Ligotti. Ligotti's short stories, which are all incredible, are quite often about characters who come face to face with some moment of decision or a moment of encounter with something which is utterly beyond them. And so in Lovecraft, you kind of descend into sort of like language collapses into unspeakability. But in Ligotti, it's that moment that's terrifying, right? This idea that there is something else, even if that something else is kind of an abyss or a void or something horrifying. It's that realization that the world itself is unfinished that is the source of its horror. So this is why I think that monstrosity is something to be kind of like politically attuned to, particularly as it's deployed discursively just in day-to-day politics, and also to recognize its fundamental. It is a kind of plastic metaphor. It is reshaped and determined through that discursive struggle.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the monstrosity itself. I mean, I always tend to read it through. I do like a bit of Adornian negative dialectics on this, which is because it's so partisan for the particular, and every object it exceeds its concept. Every concept is object. I can't help but think that Adorno would have been quite a goth if he had ever counted the term properly. I mean, thinking about the monster, we cannot not think about the monster does the monstering, and I mean, my kind of hunch is that the monster, the monster that produces, that monsterizes people, is going to be something like capitalism. It might be capitalism itself, and in its most intensifying, proliferating form, it's fascism, which creates, which essentially accelerates the production of monsters as a kind of immunological defense mechanism. And one of my favorite parts of your work, and listeners, this has been going back quite some time. I mean, it must have been about 2 years ago at the Utopian Study Society conference in Brighton, when John Labour Kyle Kern of this parish, and Frank from the left page all held a panel on the concept of Gothic Marxism. And one of the main sort of literary strains you pick up in terms of contemporary theories of monstrosity and fighting back against the monstering monster that is capitalism and fascism and its accelerated guises is through its analysis of trans horror, particularly the works of Gretchen Felker Martin and Alison Rumfitt. And even recently, after this book came out, of course, Harold Vanguard has done episodes on The People's Joker. And of course, same day release on Repeater as well, Corpses, Fools and Monsters, The History and Future of Transness in Cinema. Could we get into this idea of contemporary trans horror and how it explores and really defines the state of the monstering monster that is our contemporary fascisizing capitalism?
Yeah. So with all the due caveats that, you know, I'm not trans, and so, you know, please do check out Corpses, Fools and Monsters. It's a great book. So my argument is broadly that like monsters are produced as in some ways as a kind of like scapegoat in the sort of Gerardian terms, right? They are the sort of but like whenever they come for the monster, they will come for you. I think there's a Fanon. Is it Fanon who talks about like an old teacher said to him, "Pay attention when somebody is talking about the Jew because they're talking about you," right? And which is like if somebody is anti-Semitic, they're almost certainly going to be anti-black as well. So like the monster that is produced so that category of monstrosity is produced, but there is a genuine fear and revulsion towards the monster because that allows you to secure the system itself. But the monster can do things and can be things that the system can never conceive of, right? Manhunt is great by Gretchen Felker Martin, a kind of like gonzo bloody horror novel that's a sort of throwback to the thrillers of the lurid paperbacks of the 70s and 80s. It's amazing. It is incredibly violent, but it's also about this idea of actually solidarity is still possible, like and there is the chance of victory in the struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor. Alison Rumfitt's Tell Me I'm Worthless is just an incredible novel and is maybe the best explanation of why Britain is the way it is. And the great detail about this novel is that like it recognizes that like fascism is something that is learned. Why? Because it has a libidinal investment within it. You are not automatically a fascist, but you learn to be it because fascism promises you a kind of pleasure in the exercise of power. But the great kind of one of the great things about the novel is the degree to which it shows that fascism is confrontable, right? If you live inside the haunted house, it's a site of like enormous pain, enormous trauma, but the house can be burnt to the ground, and you can salt the earth so that nothing ever grows there again. But really, the thing that the novel that Tell Me I'm Worthless is about love, and this is not a kind of like ersatz cheap romance, but actually like love is a sort of like universal category that has enormous kind of political potential. You know, the kind of panics in British media of just virulent transphobia are this kind of horrific assault upon not just like love between persons, but actually this idea of like one can be one can belong, right? This is the thing that we want to that the British media is desperately trying not to admit. Yeah, so talking about those two books was a real kind of privilege. They're both incredible. And yes, The People's Joker, I saw the TV Glow. We're all going to the World's Fair. There is this. I think it's a little bit soon to being like there's this kind of like moment of trans horror, but I think mostly because it needs to be given a lot more time, money, and attention. But like there's so much here that is both politically salient and also engages with the actual existing material conditions of capitalism in ways that no other kind of filmmaking or writing would be able to do, right? And so I quote Judith Butler's famous op-ed where it's like, actually, this is the bleeding edge of something. This virulent transphobia that's cropped up around the world. These opponents of gender ideology. It never stops there, right? If capitalism is a monster, as this kind of immunological response, its aim is to kind of make us all complicit in its own violence. Why? Because then nobody can be blamed, because you can't blame anybody. All you can blame is the scapegoated, excluded other that we shouldn't look at, we shouldn't be drawn to. So this is why I think, this is why both of those novels are at the conclusion, because presuppose that actually they have a very accurate assessment of the current political state of things, and they presuppose that actually there are different ways that things can and should be otherwise, and that is a demand that has to be met violently if necessary, but that violence is only ever kind of like self-defensive against the ultimate like fascist violence of the society that seeks to eradicate its monsters.
No, I appreciate the affirmation that utopia can indeed be violent, especially towards the end of the book. I mean, and also, reading "Tell Me I'm Worthless" after about a year and a half stuck inside, being far too online, discovering, because of course it comes out after we have this like break from Corbyn defeat of socialism electorally in the UK, a lot of hopes in that stream, a lot of people who just sort of started being politicized. I was one of them. And then you start seeing how the country works in the crisis, the mass sacrifice of the disabled, all of the old allegiances coming in to fight against the spectre of communism, or at least the spectre of anything being better. And then I read "Tell Me I'm Worthless," and I'm like, I'm not mad. Okay. Explain to me. Okay, yes, there is something wrong with this country. It feels almost like reading that speech from V in the V for Vendetta movie, but cast across a few hundred pages, and fighting against a spectral, a version of Morrissey who is also quite a satanic ghost. Listeners, if you also pick up the book, it reminded me that I wasn't quite mad. There was something not monstrous about society, but there was a monstering factor to it that was monstrous. This is the monstering monster.
Yes, this idea of like production and so like the great thing about that book is that it's like actually there is blood that seeps out of the earth of Britain, right? There is this accumulated weight of fascism, of violence, of all kinds of imperial project building, of reactionary politics that forms this kind of like miasmatic atmosphere that you can't help but breathe in. There's an incredible, almost like single sentence chapter towards the end of the book listing off all of the ways that systems are implicated until it returns to you as the reader. You are here too, right? And you're looking at all of this stuff, and so you're only the great thing about both of these books is that they pose choices towards the end of like, really, what do you want to do with this information that you've received? What is your response going to be towards the monster, towards the figure of the other? Is it going to be to perpetuate this annihilationist violence that seeks to kind of constantly secure your own crumbling walls against the threat of the outside, or try and demolish those walls in the first place?
It makes me wonder whether, so listeners, so we had a launch event for this at the beautiful Gothic place of the Black Heart in Camden a couple of weeks ago, and one of the questions, and I think as a comrade, friend of the show, Jake, who actually brought this up, is whether or not there would be horror movies under communism. And I wonder, not just talking about, of course, the brilliant work of Alexander Herbert, who did Fear Before the Fall out on Zero Books about the Soviet horror scene. Would you say the essence of a kind of a communistic horror is a horror in which the monster is the monstering monster, not the monstered one?
Yes, I think so. Oh, and really, like the idea of a communist horror is like the recognition of the great of like hell. The recognition of a true nightmare is constantly being trapped within yourself, like completely cut off, right? Really, again, this connects it back to body horror, I think, which is like the great nightmare is always being trapped inside of our own consciousness. And so, like, a communist horror is one that goes, actually, isn't it better that we don't have to be like that anymore? Isn't it better that we're no longer trapped within the kind of terrifyingly small confines of our own skull, and the actual genuine solidarity and genuine new modes of subjective becoming are possible and should be celebrated? And yeah, obviously, A Fear Before the Fall by Alex is a great book. Yes, isn't it? The true nightmare is to be made into a monster. Is to be the monstering monster. But the great warning of horror is that there is something about that process that we enjoy, right? There's a libidinal thread that runs through it. And this returns us to the great kind of like concern of Acid Horizon. You know, why is it that we want our own domination? Why? Or Wilhelm Reich's answer to fascism, which is like, there's a pleasure in it. And so that kind of horror serves as a warning against it, and an illustration of what happens if that warning isn't heeded.
I mean, speaking of the temptation, the libidinal aspects of horror, there's one figure I wouldn't say is missing from this book, but I'd like to ask a slight curveball in terms of how he interacts in the theories of Gothic Marxism, which is Satan. Satan is an ambiguous figure. I mean, we spoke to Vernon Sisney ages back on Acid Horizon, and sometimes Satan is seen as a figure of liberation against the sort of austere practices of the church. Sometimes he is the figure of eternal damnation, which is either part of the economy of salvation or adverse to it. And sometimes, as Vernon points out in, for example, the works of someone like Joyce Carol Oates, Satan is not given any metaphysical status. He is just patriarchy. He is just a man. He is the manhood itself, which embeds itself in a patriarchal society. I mean, what does Gothic Marxism have to say about Satan? Is Satan something as you take in different contexts? Is there an archetype? Is something satanic about capitalism, or is Satan more of a kind of a mode of expression of those very same kind of anxieties and social struggles as someone like Dracula might be?
I mean, this like ultimately this comes back to a sort of your own opinion on how strict a materialist you really want to be. Is there, and truthfully, I think there's probably an entire book to be written about like a Marxist approach to Satan in history and culture. But like the thing that it made me think of is the Keanu Reeves film Constantine, which is honestly a great movie. And Satan arrives, pollutes the earth before he can stand on it, right? What seems like tar dripping from his feet. And I think the danger with talking about Satan is that you end up inevitably doing a kind of like traditional theology, right? That's the danger of it. But I think the great value is, again, in this notion of like a multivalent metaphor that structures how we relate to ideas of liberation and damnation. Are we in like perhaps at the moment when there is this kind of great moralism of contemporary capitalism, you can't admit any alternative. You can't, like, this idea of like, even if it were possible, you shouldn't want that because it's a wrong thing to want, right? Quite often used in the context of the violence in Palestine, where it's like, no, you want the wrong thing. You don't understand that your desires actually make you anti-Semitic or whatever, right? Maybe there is value to be had in claiming the kind of like Miltonic Satan of like, actually isn't it not better to, instead of demanding admittance to this kingdom that has cast us out, but to form another one? Maybe there's value to that in this particular moment. I my own tendency is to kind of agree with the point you made from Joyce Carol Oates about, is there a metaphysical Satan? It doesn't really matter, because we're equally capable of doing the worst kinds of horrific violence and exploitation to one another without the metaphysical mediator of Satan. But I think, ultimately, yes, Satan is Satan and death are two twin absent figures. But these are the kind of they are the structuring or mediating forces that actually give horror its coherence, I think, because what are we truly revolted by or repulsed by? Is the threat to our souls or the threat to our lives? And sometimes that's the same thing, right? Sometimes that's the same thing. Sometimes losing one's soul is actually a kind of moment of liberation. Sometimes death is not the end of things. Sometimes it continues, right? But yeah, I think maybe that would be my point, which is like, maybe there's value to be found in that old Miltonic idea that, you know, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven.
I mean, given the heaven that our various billionaire overlords have chosen for us, I think I'd agree on that front.
Yeah, I would. Which would you rather have?
Better to reign in London than serve on Mars. Not as if London is the equivalent of hell there, but let's just leave that where it is. Let's not open that can of worms. But regardless, we're coming to the hour now. John, thank you so much for coming on today. I mean, I completely agree with the Miltonian idea here, particularly in terms of maybe sometimes it personifying Satan and death detracts from their horrific elements. I mean, one of my favorite characters in all fiction is Death from Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, and he's actually, you know, he's lovely. You can't make.
I mean, this is the thing Pratchett says about death, which is that death is not cruel. Death is just very good at his job. Right? He's a kind of he's sort of an antiquarian when it comes to humans, right? He takes an interest in us, which is sort of the problem, but also it's where all the interesting things happen. I think sometimes personifying those things is useful. Sometimes it's not. But I think this idea of Lucifer as opposed to an order of heavenly violence. The theologian Adam Kotsko's book on the political theology of neoliberalism is very good on this point, right? The political theology of neoliberalism is to create this kind of perfect city wherein those who are included get to watch for all eternity as the rest of us are punished, right? In that case, whose side would you rather be on? Is there not something to be said for this Miltonic struggle against the authorities of heaven? But yeah, Satan and death, two subjects for the next book, maybe.
Well, we live in that heaven, don't we? We do get to watch through our screens every day people being subjected to the worst things in human history. And St. Thomas Aquinas, you can go fuck yourself because it's nothing heavenly about it. It's okay, he's been dead for a while. He'll forgive me. I don't believe in session, so it's fine. But regardless, Capitalism, A Horror Story is out now from all good bookstores and the one bad one. John, of course, people find you at Horror Vanguard, at Liquid Guy, and of course at the Haunt blog as well. Are you working on anything else at the moment? I know you're doing a lot of research into post-rock, not post-punk, sorry.
Yes, I'm working on another book. It's going to be a full-length study on post-rock, covering Godspeed You Black Emperor, Sigur Rós, Mogwai, Explosions in the Sky, a host of other bands, and talking about them through primarily philosophies of music from Bloch and Benjamin, and trying to argue for post-punk from 1999 to about now being a kind of soundscape for a utopian struggle, for this idea of a world that could be transformed. Hopefully that will be the next thing that's out in terms of horror studies stuff. I've just started working on what I think will be another book, and this is going to be something that will be a full-length study on debt and haunted houses, particularly in the context of America, looking at things like the fall of the House of Usher or Nathaniel Hawthorne, and going all the way up to things like the Halloween franchise and Candyman. So those are the next two big projects that I've got.
Beautiful. So, folks, you can also, of course, buy John's Utopia, Introduction to the Work of Ernst Bloch, over on Zero Books, and of course Capitalism, A Horror Story right now. If people aren't just listening to it, they can't please put the books up, but you can still see them on the video feed. Go buy them early, buy them often. All I have to say now is, John, thank you much for joining me today, and we'll catch you folks later.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.